Good evening. Welcome. This is Beth from Around the Table Yarns. I'm here with Pam, and we're here with Kate Atherley, who is going to entertain us with songs of delight. No, she's going to teach us all about knitting design, knitwear design. And we're really excited to have you here with us for this last class in this current series. And we're looking forward to planning more classes with you in the near future.
Thank you so much. Thank you for hosting me. It's been really delightful. And it's been lovely to get to know you a little bit before I come and spend some time with you in person. So this has been very exciting for me. So thank you. And I feel like I'm getting to know not just you guys and your dogs. I'm getting to know some of the students too, some return faces, which is a delight. So thank you so much. So, and today is all about knitwear design, and I've got, as with the other classes, I've got slides here. And what I will do is when we're finished, based on what we talk about and based on the slides that I present, I'll create a summary document and I will send that. Then that can be sent around. So because this conversation can be a pretty broad one, there's lots of stuff connected to this topic. So this is where I always begin with this class, that I'm, rather than saying this is what I'm going to cover, these are the topics that generally I get asked about in this sort of arena of knitwear design, and so talk about kind of how we do it, give you an insight into kind of my design process, and everybody's is different, but yeah, talk about size and grading, yarn choice and yarn support. We can talk about copyright, we can talk about the process, test knitting, technical editing, all of that stuff. But what's most important really is that I check in with you guys, because I want to know what you want to know. I want to know what will be relevant and what will be helpful. I'd love to hear from you guys. Are you thinking about this from the perspective of just customizing things for yourself? Or are you thinking about this from the perspective of creating patterns for publication? Does that make sense? So tell me a bit about what you'd like to, what I can help you with, how we should direct this discussion most usefully. And Beth and Pam, I'm happy to hear from you guys too.
Well, I unmuted myself first, so
Okay. All right, go
I'll
on
go
then.
first. I think that I think a lot of us would like you to draw back the curtain a little bit on
Okay.
the,
Yeah.
like, I wrote this pattern and, or I have this idea for a pattern.
Yeah.
What do I need to do? And I think that that's maybe a little bit of a mystery to people. Like,
Okay. Yeah.
what goes into, um, what you need to share a pattern, even if it's not a pattern that's going on Ravelry.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Always happy to talk about that. Yeah. And you're right. I think it probably is a little bit of a mystery, right? I produced a set of instructions. How did I come up with that? So yeah, happy to talk about that. Yeah.
I would say that at this point in my life, I don't have a desire to expand into writing patterns,
Yeah.
but as a shop owner, I read a lot of patterns, and we end up having to modify a lot of patterns.
Yeah.
And sometimes people come in with a pattern they've found somewhere. You don't have all the some of the services that Ravelry offers. They found it somewhere.
Yeah.
So understanding a little bit more of how a pattern is created, I'm hoping I can be a better pattern reader and maybe a better
Whichever.
pattern modifier
Yeah.
to see what goes into the pattern, and then how can I help adjust it to either my needs or someone else's needs. So
Yeah. That makes sense.
I just
Yeah.
want to understand the process because I think that will help me
Yeah.
overall. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. And I see Deborah has typed into the chat. Hi, Deborah, and thank you. Deborah hopes to learn by understanding how to design in order to approach recreating a store-bought cardigan.
Oh, interesting.
Ooh, that's an interesting one.
I like that.
That is. May I go next, everybody?
Absolutely.
This is
Yes.
Doris, and I don't know why my camera's not working, but I promise I really am here.
That's okay. We can hear you. Well, we're imagining, you're a spy, so you're hiding, your true identity. It's
Wit
fine. It's fine.
Witness protection program,
Yeah,
huh?
that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Knitters protection program.
my situation is that I have a little gig once a month as a teacher of knitting at a city library.
Very cool.
And it's a city that is economically disadvantaged, and
Yeah,
so the class is free. We uh, try to get donated needles and yarns. It's a real work of love, managing all of this.
yeah,
So my need is to offer these brand new, they've never touched needles before kinds
yeah.
of folks and simplify patterns. I do not use, I maintain the copyright laws. I do not just photocopy stuff and then, they're on their own. I take, free patterns. But I'm finding even those can be too complicated. Beginner knitting is not beginner knitting. There's a below beginner knitting. Some of them have literacy issues.
Okay.
So basically, what I teach is how to knit a rectangle. And if you fold it this way, you get one thing. And if you fold it and sew it that way, you get something else.
Yeah.
But those directions, how to have them be clear for a basic literacy level person. And it's all ages, from teenagers
Right.
to adults to senior citizens. But again, this is a low income area, blue collar working class folk. And so that's my need.
Interesting. Okay. So with that one, I think there are some resources that I'm going to point you to. And I might not address it directly, but it's a conversation I'd kind of love to have with you. And I think, yeah, I'll point you to some resources and we'll dip our toe into it. But I have to say, when I in teaching this class, I get asked a lot of kind of questions, and many of them are, not to say that you guys are unoriginal, many of them are already kind of heading in the direction we've already talked about. This one, Doris, is one that's a little bit unusual. So I'm going to give you some resources I'm sure will help, but we may want to continue that conversation after the class, if that makes sense.
I would love to do that,
Okay.
Kate. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right.
Thank
No,
you
thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.
I think one other thing that I would just say is that in evaluating patterns, that we work with customers that there doesn't seem to be universal language.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know how or if you touch on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that it would be so simple, right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so I think both of those point to a discussion about assessing a good pattern, right? Kind of determining what makes a good pattern. So I'm sorry, my keyboard's quite noisy. I'm making notes for myself here. So what makes a good pattern?
Okay. I
Yeah.
found some problems with patterns that were not originally in English.
Yeah,
And
true.
literally, the translations, it might be a term that everybody in Germany knows what it
Yeah.
means.
Yeah.
But so I don't know if, that
Yeah.
is an issue that anybody else might have stumbled across.
Yeah, well, and there's a yarn company called Drops. Are people familiar with Drops? They've got some lovely yarns. They have a huge library of free patterns on their website. The company's based in Scandinavia somewhere, forgive me, I don't remember exactly where. And they have a lot of patterns in English, but I believe they are machine translated. I don't think they are translated by humans. And so the language of those patterns is definitely challenging. So yeah, absolutely. It can be, and without kind of being glib about that one, if we're dealing with beginners, it's find a pattern that was written in, initially in English, right? Yeah, because there are ones that I've seen for Drops that make me scratch my head. Not to say that, I'm the be all and end all of reading patterns, but I got some experience over here. So yeah, if they're making me scratch my head, then yeah. So nice things, be cautious. So you're quite right about that. Translation is a challenge. Yeah. Yeah. All right, so I'm gonna start chatting, but I want you guys to absolutely ask me questions, and let's keep this as a discussion. Fair? Perfect. All right, so slide number 1 here. And I want to make this sort of important. This may seem like sort of an obvious statement, but we need to distinguish between 2 aspects of this. There's designing, and then there's writing up the instructions. And so designing is the kind of thing that we're talking about, recreating a garment, you know, and pattern writing is about reworking those instructions, and they're quite different disciplines. And what's interesting about these is I think they use, not I think, I'm going to correct myself there. I absolutely know they use different parts of your brain, and different people suit different tasks. So there'll be some things where you're really good at it, and something else where this may be not my bag, and that's okay. You don't have to be a designer or to create your own garment or to customize a garment. You don't need to love both pieces of the puzzle. Okay. And I like to distinguish them because in the word design, they get muddled a little bit. So when I talk about designing, I mean coming up with a new thing and knitting it, right? And then pattern writing is writing out the instructions so someone else can knit it too. Simple enough, differentiation. But we use the words get a little bit muddled, right? But in terms of imagining what the process is, I think those are 2 distinct tasks. But we use, well, and maybe this is the crux of it, we use fuzzy language, right, to describe some of this stuff. So I was asked for a peek behind the curtain about my own design process, and this is where I'll be completely honest. My own design process, it requires a lot of caffeine. Everybody's design process is different, right? Everybody works different ways. So I will tell you about how it works for me, other than caffeine. Now, this time of year, it tends to be cold rather than hot, but either way. But what's sort of what the design process involves is it really is a multi-step process that involves a bunch of things. And the order in which we do these things can differ from project to project, but they all need to be involved. There is some knitting, right? We have to do some knitting. There's, you know, research. There's you cannot avoid it, swatching. It's gonna happen. It's absolutely going to happen. The neat thing about being a designer, let me talk about swatching for a second. As a designer, the very good news about that is that what you're doing is you're knitting a sample and you're measuring it, and someone else is the one who's going to have to do the testing with the multiple needles to make sure that they can match. So, you know, you may knit yourself a sample, but you're the boss of that. So, you know, it's a little, the relationship is a little bit different. Yeah, fair. And then there's going to be calculations to be done too. And for me, this tends to be a little bit iterative. Some designers design on the needles, right? They'll start knitting and they'll kind of figure stuff out as they go. I tend to do the research first. I kind of start with a concept. I will then knit a swatch. You know, I will check, see how the pattern stitch is. In the yarn that I've chosen, I will test the yarns, and in fact, I may lean over, it's slightly out of reach. I will show you a swatch for a design that I'm working on right now. And then I tend to do a bunch of the calculations before I start knitting. Now, does that mean I knit something and I'm done? I've done the calculations and I knit something and I'm done with it? Heck no. The arrows go around and around, because generally when I'm designing something, by the time I'm finished, I can usually you know, I will have probably knitted it twice. I might not knit the whole thing twice through from, if it's a garment, I might not knit both the sleeves twice and the front and the back twice. But in terms of kind of expectation of knitting time, I'm planning for myself, allow myself time to knit it through twice, because, you know, I might need to spend some time reworking the collar and the neck after I've tried it on. I might realize that I'm running into a structural problem where I don't love how the shoulders fit on the body, or I might run into an issue. I ran into an issue very recently, by the way, with a pair of mittens that I designed, and it was all about yardage. I designed a pair of mittens and I absolutely loved them, and there was going to be 4 sizes. And the second size, so first size, absolutely, I used a single ball of yarn. It was a DK weight, used a single ball of yarn. The second size, that was the sample that I made, used basically all but 2 yards of the ball of yarn. And that, as a designer, is a nightmare. It's a nightmare for you guys too. It's a fascinating, and so I was talking about this on social media. That is a disaster, because yeah, I mean, it's okay when you've got a project where it's knit until you're done, right? Until your yardage is used up. I mean, and that's why I love, for example, knitting socks toe up, because you just knit till you're running out of yarn, right? Or a hat. I make my hats top down for the same reason. You can kind of knit, you know, and people like top down garments for the same reason. You can kind of on the fly, you can adjust for your yardage. But this particular mitten design, you really can't. Like, you can't have one mitten that's open at the top, and the other one that's closed at the top. So with something like that, what happens is that if I say for that second size, you have to buy 2 balls of yarn, you're essentially having somebody buy 2 balls of yarn so that the second ball is just for the swatch, right? The yardage is just for the swatch. And so could I write, well, you can measure your gauge as you go, because you can undo like the swatch and reknit that yarn. So technically you could actually get that size of mitten out of a single skein of yarn, out of a single ball, assuming you did indeed match gauge, right? Because this is the whole thing about, oh yeah, I know, I'm sorry, I'm at risk of turning this class into a gauge lecture. I can turn any class into a gauge lecture, but we're thinking about it differently here. As a designer, to have a pattern where really, if somebody matches my gauge, you know, and they were really specific instructions. There wasn't any element of this mitten where it was knit until it was the right length, because I had some pattern stitches. Everything was kind of fixed lengths. So if somebody matched my gauge and were willing to undo and reknit their swatch, they can absolutely get that pair of mittens out of a single ball of yarn. Brilliant. So as a designer, do I tell them 1 or do I tell them 2? And if I tell them that they need to buy 2 balls of yarn, then, and they don't need it, are they going to get mad at me? It's an interesting conundrum, right? So what happened with that one was that I knitted it. It was great. I was really happy with it, but I ended up adjusting it. I ended up making some adjustments. So I would 100% use part of the second ball of yarn. I lengthened the cuff, so that knitters would feel like they were getting value. They needed to buy that second ball of yarn, and they were getting value from that second ball of yarn. I could have done it the other way. I could have shortened it, but it actually looked really pretty with a nice long detailed cuff, so that was okay. But so there's interesting things where I'm expecting I'm going to knit it, but I will expect that elements will need to be reknitted. So I made my first mitten. I didn't, by the way, I knew this was going to happen before I knitted the pair, because I weighed it, right? So any knitwear designer is using it, you know, and spinners, we have digital scales. I have one in my kitchen for baking, and I have one in the cupboard back there for knitting purposes, right? So I weighed my first mitten, and my first mitten was basically exactly half the ball of yarn, and I knew that was going to be a problem. So yeah, so from a re-knitting perspective, I you know, I don't want to over egg that particular point, but as a designer, yeah, I need to know, I need to be okay with the fact that where I'm going with this is we need to rip out, we need to knit and rip and knit and rip, and it really is an iterative process. As a designer, I have never simply calculated a thing, cast on, knitted it, and have it be done. Never. Now, we like knitting, right? So that's okay. Just set your expectations so that you know that you're experimenting. And this is the brilliant thing about knitting. Unlike baking, for example, because baking, if those cookies didn't turn out right, well, you can't get that flour back, right? Those chocolate chips are gone. They're used, right? Fabric, you cut the fabric, it's over, right? Whereas with yarn, we can absolutely 100% undo it. Yeah. But in terms of what order I do these things, and it really does depend on, you know, sort of my inspiration. And sometimes it's about I've fallen in love with a ball of yarn and I need to figure out what to do with it. Sometimes it's, and I mean, those are my Barbara Walker stitch dictionaries, and I'm a huge fan of those. I've got 2 huge shelves behind me of stitch dictionaries. You can see the Barbara Walker ones on the top shelf. Sometimes I will flip through a stitch dictionary and just fall in love with a pattern stitch and think, oh, holy cow, I gotta use that. I gotta figure out, I want to make a sock with that cable or something. So sometimes it's about that. Sometimes I've got a finished object in mind where, okay, I need a mitten, right? So, you know, and it can vary from project to project. So all of those are are great places to kick off, and we all do it differently from project to project and from time to time. But whatever it is, it's always iterative, and all of those things go together. Now, how I learned to design. So this is Isaac Newton. And I studied science and mathematics at university. And Isaac Newton was actually fairly self-effacing about his achievements in many ways. When people would tell him he was a genius and he had achieved great things. I am not, by the way, for the record, comparing myself to Isaac Newton here, not at all. But when people asked how he had achieved what he was able to achieve, his feats of genius, because he was a genius in physics and mathematics and various other things. Did you know he ran the mint for a while and solved a problem that they were having, the Royal Mint, with forgeries? But yeah, anyway, when people asked him how he was able to achieve so much, he said that he was able to see so far because he stood on the shoulders of giants. And this is so important. The British pound coin has Newton on it, and it says on the edge of the coin, standing on the shoulders of giants. Anyway, so, but okay, how is this relevant to us? Well, I am all about standing on the shoulders of giants. I am all about leveraging what others have done before me. And in particular, this will be very useful for the person who wants to recreate an existing garment. Particularly if your objective is not about publishing, right, where we're not so focused on uniqueness, then there's resources we can use. But in terms of sort of how I learned to design, how this began for me was that I started by designing socks and only socks. For years, all I did was design socks because that was what I knew. And again, this is going to sound like a ridiculous statement, sort of an obvious statement, but if you've not knitted a bunch of garments, you are, and I mean this with great love and respect, you're not equipped yet to design a garment. There's a lot that you need to know because there's a lot that goes into these things. And so before, when someone says that they want to learn how to design hats, knit a lot of hats. And in knitting a lot of them, yes, you're knitting a lot of them and you're learning about them. You're also understanding, reading the instructions and how the instructions are written. And so this goes back to the point, asking the point about sort of how the patterns are written too. And so, you know, Pam mentioned that you see a lot of patterns in the stores. Heck yeah, absolutely. But those are an incredible resource. And there's probably a lot of stuff you've learned a lot about, whether you're aware of it or not, just by having read through those patterns. And then, you know, for me, I'm always looking at the things that we don't know and the things that aren't talked about in knitting patterns. And so we think about, for example, you know, when I'm thinking about designing hats, a lot of the time, you know, I look at the difference between the sorts of things that we can produce hand knitted versus the kinds of things that we buy in the stores. And are there differences between those? And does that point to a limitation in what we can do with hand knits versus machine versus commercial knit stuff, right? And so this is where, you know, I am always, so August and September are really exciting for me. I'm always spending time at the mall in August and September because that's when the knitwear appears in the stores. And I'm always investigating and kind of creeping the knitwear just to see what's what in terms of how stuff's put together, right? I love trying stuff on, and I would encourage people now, you know, be respectful about this. But going into the stores and trying garments on, and even if it's something you wouldn't necessarily buy, and again, we're going to do it with respect to the store and the items. I'm forever trying stuff on and looking at it. It's like, oh, that hat looks really interesting. I'm going to try that on. I'm going to examine it. And I love creeping into the dressing room and, you know, trying stuff on and taking photographs of it. So, yeah, we look at what's in the store and we can use that for inspiration. We can also use that. There's a lot to be learned from, again, what we don't do in hand knitting or what store-bought knits don't do. And I'm going to say something outrageous here, okay? And if you took my size and fit class, you will have heard me talk a little bit about this. But in hand knitting, we do something a lot, which is make a garment seamlessly without sewing up. You don't see garments constructed like that in the stores. You don't see them very often. It's not because the technology doesn't exist. The technology 100% exists to make garments seamlessly. But think about why we might do it one way versus the other. Okay. A lot of the time, knit garments need seams because they provide structure so the garment doesn't fall out of shape, right? So differences there in what we do in hand knitting, what we do with knit fabrics and knit structures in the stores. Yeah, so just some interesting things. Now, if you're looking at if thinking about making something you like to wear, if we're recreating an existing garment, then of course we're going to inspect that to a fantastic level of detail, right? And sewers do this. They actually take garments. I've seen sewers take garments apart and use them as pattern pieces, effectively trace the patterns and then sew them back together. So lots of examining and lots of researching, okay? And then in terms of how we're designing, standing on the shoulders of giants. So again, if you're not looking to specifically kind of sell patterns, then it is not only a good idea, but in fact, it's the best idea to work with existing patterns as a template. So if I may give an incredibly quick answer to the question about recreating an existing garment, what I would do is I would find a pattern that exists for something that's really very, very close in structure and in all of those details and use that as a jumping off point. And again, you know, I talked a little bit about this in my size and fit class. You find something that's as close as possible and alter the cosmetic details. So if there's a pattern for something that's almost exactly what you want, but the edges are different, or the length is different, or the sleeve length is different, then those kinds of things are easy to alter. The core structure, stand on the shoulders of giants, use those existing patterns to, you know, find something that's got the right structure for you, that has the right core size, that has the right kind of weight of fabric in terms of gauge, that kind of thing. And then simplify the task for yourself, right? So could you build it from the ground up? Absolutely. 100%. And if you want to develop a sweater pattern from the ground up, from first principles, to talk mathematically for a moment, you can 100% do that. And there's a couple of books that I will cheerfully point you to. But for some people, the exercise is less about enjoying the mathematics and more about making sure that the sweater comes out right. And in that case, use the resources that are available to you. Yeah, fair. So yeah, if that makes sense. So I'm all about that. It's the simplest and frankly the least stressful way of getting something that you want. Okay. Now, what I did as a designer was, I mentioned I began with socks. And so I had a vanilla sock pattern that I knew fitted me. That took a little bit of tweaking because I've got smallish feet. I had a plain sock pattern that fitted me. And then what I started to do was experiment with that. I experimented with that. So I took my plain sock and, whoa, would it work if I put some cables in it? That was a huge learning because, oh, it turns out, no, it doesn't work because cables compress the fabric and take the stretch out of it. So no, I can't take my usual 56 stitch sock and work cables on it because it doesn't fit anymore. Big learning, right? Equally, I took my standard 56 stitch sock and worked lace on it, and it was too big, right? So learning about how the fabric interacts with the structure. Now, does this mean that you have to knit 100 different garments? No, not necessarily. This is the advantage to doing small things. Now, socks are small, and I actually, as a sock designer, have a fair number of single socks. They're good for demos and classes and things that I just never kind of finished because it doesn't fit me or it didn't come out the way that I want. If you're talking about garments, an excellent way to experiment with garments is actually kids' garments, baby sweaters. So how I taught myself to sort of, you know, work with garment structures was I knit a whole ton of baby sweaters. I was so well supplied for baby shower gifts for years and years and years. Although don't make the mistake that I did. The mistake that I did was how I stacked them in the cupboard. Because the first one was in the bottom of the cupboard and the most recent one was at the top. And by the time I was kind of coming back down to the bottom of my baby shower gift pile, I was coming to some ones that I think were pretty raw and that I wasn't very proud of. So put them in the opposite order. But yeah, either way. But there's so much to be learned, and sometimes we really just do have to knit it. So, but take pattern stitches and apply them to basic shapes and styles, or take existing designs and change the size or shape, which means that I am a massive fan of pattern books that have lots of kind of vanilla designs in them, lots of plain designs. And this is actually kind of these are the books that I write, right? So there's, for example, are you guys familiar with, I will have talked about this already, Anne Budd's Handy Book of Sweater Patterns. That book is incredible. It's an incredible resource, and this can be useful for creating something from scratch or, you know, taking it as a template. So that if your objective is a satin sleeve sweater, but with some specific striping patterns and using a particular yarn, and you want the neckline to be exactly the way you want it, and you want a 3/4 sleeve, and you want to do all of those details, I'm going to point you to that. Start with what's in the Ann Budd book, right? And so there's books like that that exist for garments. There's books like that that exist for socks and mittens, because I've written those. There's books like, in the patterns, plain patterns in multiple sizes and multiple gauges. There's a book like that that exists for hats, right? There's this kind of book like that for shawls too. So, if your objective is, and there's no right or wrong answer here. I'm not saying that there's one of these is the right answer and one of these isn't the right answer. If your objective is about making a thing that's perfect the way you want it, then use those resources, use those books, and take that and tweak the thing that already exists. And frankly, I find that more fun. It's less stressful, and I like doing the math. Does that make sense? And what's interesting about that too is that what you can do is it's incredibly powerful, right? Because you can work from a bunch of different resources. And I always talk about, what I call the Franken pattern strategy, where I take one aspect of one garment and another aspect. So I might take kind of the core structure from the Ann Budd, one of the Ann Budd patterns, but I'm applying a color detail that I've seen in another pattern, and I might use the striping that I've seen in another pattern and combine these elements, right, to create exactly what you want. You do not have to begin from the ground up. Does that all make sense? And even if you are ready to begin, you do want to begin from the ground up, starting with these kind of exercises in the same way that we have to do stretches before we do a marathon. Never run a marathon in my life, but people have told me, you have to do training runs before you run a marathon. Start by learning this, by learning what you can from patterns that already exist. But yeah, knit lots of small things. Taught me an awful lot about understanding shapes and how they work.
Question?
Yes, of course.
I love the idea of a Frankenstein pattern
Yeah.
where you take a piece of this and a part of that and you mix it
Yeah.
together.
Yeah.
So my question is, are you disrespecting other designers' patterns when you do something like that? And can you really say that, well, I designed this, when you're taking bits of pieces from other people's work? I really want to respect the original designer and their, what's it called, intellectual property.
Well, so the answer to that question depends massively on what you're doing with it. If you are just knitting one thing for you or as a gift, then you can do whatever the heck you want with it. When was the last time you followed a recipe exactly as written? So perhaps a slightly trite analogy, but you can do whatever you want with it. So and I love the way you framed it, because you can do whatever you want with that. Now, if you are looking to publish, that's a really different question. And respect doesn't come into it. Intellectual property, copyright comes into it. So no, you couldn't, for example, you couldn't take the Ann Budd, what's in the Ann Budd templates, knit it in a color, knit it plain, and publish it as your own work. Heck no, not at all. That is a violation of copyright. You couldn't take one of my sock patterns for my book and just add a stripe and call it your own. No. But can you do that for yourself? Heck yeah, of course. Pam had a hand up. Yeah.
I think a really good example that's recent is the Sophie scarf.
Yes.
There have been dozens of almost exactly adding a stripe, that kind of thing, and then either offering it for free or it's been hard to watch, and you wonder, I've seen some comments and things of like, this is exactly, she did this, she did it first. And how do you, and to respect that?
Wow. So I'm moving ahead of my deck here because I have some notes on this
Okay.
one specifically, and I have a picture from a while ago, but about copyright and originality.
Okay.
Because this is a really good one. There is, and this is where the sort of the word respect a little bit comes. There's kind of a technical legal questions, and then there's an ethical question.
Right.
Okay. You cannot copyright a basic concept of a knitted item. Okay. You cannot copyright a hat. You cannot copyright a shawl. You cannot copyright a scarf pattern, right? A scarf. What you can copyright and what the owner of the Sophie scarf owns is combination of things. Her conception of the project.
Yeah.
Okay. Which is to say the exact size that it was knitted at, the choice of the yarn, the gauge it was worked at, the stitch count that it's increased to, right? The details of that particular execution, plus the instructions, plus the photographs, right? All of those go together to be something that the designer is copyrights and owns. So these people who are creating things that look like it, and I've got another slide here that speaks to exactly that situation. Are you guys familiar with the bobble hat?
Yes.
And then the things, I think that cowl was called something like Let's Go to Rhinebeck. From a legal perspective, the one on the right is not considered, you could argue that that's not a copyright violation. And the reason that a lawyer would tell you that's not a copyright violation is that the idea of that salt and pepper stitch pattern that's used kind of above and below the animals, that is not by any stretch of the imagination unique. That's in a million different knitwear designs. I mean, it's in a million different stitch dictionaries, right? The feather and fan pattern stitch is not unique. Okay, there are no stitch patterns that are unique. And even the concept of having these little knitted animals, that's, sheep motif appear in hand knits and in hand knit designs all the time. So legally, you would not be able to say that that's, the designer can be extremely upset, and they should be. But legally, that's not going to be something that is actionable. Now, there is, however, an ethical question.
Yeah.
And ethically, that's a problem. And ethically, all of these variations of the Sophie scarf, well, yeah, I mean, the thing is about the Sophie scarf is one could point to that one and say that's actually a recreation of something called the Bactus. Is anybody else old enough to remember the Bactus scarf, right?
Yeah.
So what the designer of the Sophie scarf is able to sell is their conception, their execution, and their instructions.
Okay.
So it's an interesting challenge, right? So the word respect, and is a good one here in this con. If you're doing it for you, that you needn't worry about it. If you're publishing, right? And so you are well within your rights to publish instructions for a sideways knit scarf in garter stitch with an I-cord edging, because that on its own is not a unique thing to you.
Okay.
Yeah? In my first knitting book, there is a pattern for a scarf, a feather and fan scarf. There have probably been hundreds of thousands of, tens of thousands of versions of that pattern been published, right? So yeah, so it's an interesting thing, and but I, distinguish very clearly what you intend to do with it. Yeah. And I would say to someone who said that they wanted to sell a patent or publish a patent for a sideways knit scarf that with an I-cord edging and garter stitch like the Sophie scarf, my answer to them was, you could do it, but you're kind of being a jerk.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, if I would also say to them, like, why? It exists.
Right.
So come up with something unoriginal. So yeah, it's an interesting question. So the use of the word respect is not wrong at all, but it's thorny, right?
Yeah.
It's absolutely thorny. So yeah. So I've got a slide here. If this is about publishing, if you intend to publish, and by the way, I'm saying publish, not sell, because you could give something away for free and it's still a problem. Okay. What's original, what be considered original is a new execution of an item, but it doesn't have to be a new or a unique or an original item. Because again, there's a lot of sweaters out there, right? There's a lot of patents for seamless raglans. There's a lot of patents for garter stitch scarves. There's a lot of patents for plain top down socks with a heel flap. I've written a bunch, right? So those are original if you've executed it yourself, in that you've come up with the stitch counts. If you've created those instructions, right? You've chosen the yarn, you've chosen the gauge at which it's worked. You can create an item using a stitch pattern from a stitch library. There's an asterisk there. There are actually a couple of Japanese stitch dictionaries. I did say that you can't really copyright a stitch pattern. There's a couple of Japanese stitch dictionaries where there's some copyright, and they put some limitations on how you can use the stitch patterns that are feature. But again, if you're thinking about making something for yourself, it's fine. Because really what copyright is about how people making money from your work, or people having a business value even, which is why we give stuff away for free from your work. And a recreation of a vintage finished objects is perfectly fine too. But the concept of tweaks and things, when I was first becoming a designer, this was years ago, someone said, well, if you change 5 things, you've made it original. No, we have to begin from the ground up to declare it as our own work. So you can't just change the yarn and have it be your own. You can't just create a kid's version of an adult garment. If the intention is to make something that looks like that thing that already exists and has already been published, then you're into a problem. But again, it's a massive gray area, right? Yeah. It's a massive gray area. So, I mean, I've run into this myself. There's a designer you will have heard of, this guy called Stephen West. He and I published shawl patterns, beginner friendly shawl patterns, at the same time, unawares of each other, right? We were just beginning. And mine is called, because I'm rubbish at naming patterns, I believe I called it the basic triangle shawl. I was using it for class. And his is called Boneyard. They're the same. If you look at them, they're the same. I think his edging has got one more row of garter than mine, but that's it. They're the same concept. Does that mean one of us was violating the copyright of the other? No, because we came up with them separately. So they can exist. They can absolutely exist, but together at the same time, because we've executed them differently. He and I chose really different yarns. We wrote up the instructions really differently, but the thing. So are these people who are publishing the thing that looks like the Sophie scarf violating copyright? No, chances are no. But are they being jerks? I would say absolutely yes. So yeah, that's a very long answer to a short question, but it's thorny. I mean, it's a good one and it's kind of thorny. Yeah. So, because what, again, we've got the originality question, then we've got the copyright question. Okay. Because copyright and what you can copyright, because copyright is about giving the person who developed the material or publishes the material the right to control how their work is used. The language is copies are made of their work, but how their work is used. So you can copyright, again, your execution, which is the yarn you chose, plus your stitch counts, plus your gauge, plus your instructions, your photographs, your charts, your illustrations. And we would do this by saying, I would say copyright Kate Atherley and sticking a year on it. But actually, you don't even need to do that. Just by publishing it and putting your name on it. Yeah. And you can state specific rules and exemptions. It's up to you. This is about you making a statement about how your work can be used or should be used. For example, patent may not be used to make items for sale. There are knitwear designers who do that. And the reason that they do that is because they feel that other people shouldn't be making money off their intellectual property, which, you know what, that's reasonable. Patent may be photocopied or copied or scanned for personal use only. Yeah. Which is to say, please don't go photocopying and handing it out to everybody you know. And some designers might put language around teaching, and you may not be used for a class or can be used for a class under certain conditions, seek a license, what have you. Yeah, all of that stuff. But yeah, it's complicated, right? Yeah, it's a little bit thorny. Oh yeah, but to go back, so do we need to think about respect? Well, if you're just doing it for yourself, you can do whatever the heck you want. If you do plan to publish, what you need to do is it really needs to be original in terms of your concept, your execution, and all of those instructions and all of the elements of the instructions. Might it be something that looks like something else that exists? Well, chances are yes. It is rare that there is an item that's unique. I talk about this on a regular basis because it tickles me, but it's also true. There are quite literally hundreds of patents for crochet Godzilla dolls. There's nothing unique out there, but it's a bunch of elements that come together. Is that kind of a vague, helpful, unhelpful answer? Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Yeah. Yeah. I wish there were hard and fast rules about this. It would make our lives easier. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, if you want to design a pattern for a hat, then you can absolutely do that. And if it turns out there's a hat that looks like that in a book, that's okay, right? If it's I would say this, and again, this comes down to ethics. If it's a particularly distinctive hat and you're creating something that looks like it, again, may or may not be a copyright violation, kind of an ethical violation. But if it's a plain, hat with ribbing on the edges and worked in stockinette stitch, then go for it, right? Go for it. So yeah. So shall we talk about how we might design a hat? Talk about the process. So when I'm thinking about a hat, there's a bunch of questions that I need to answer. The style. What kind of hat am I making? Am I making a fitted hat? Am I making a slouchy hat? Is it got a ribbed edging or a rolled edging or garter stitch? Do I want, what do I want to work from the top down or the bottom up, right? Those kinds of questions. Who is the hat for? Is it for, adults, kids, babies, a wide range of sizes, right? What yarn am I going to use? What fiber, the yarn type, the yarn thickness, or what stitch pattern. You know, stockinette stitch, ribbing, texture stitch, cables, lace, color work. And so in you making all of these decisions yourself, this is original work, right? So we're going to make a hat. So step one is decide who it's for. And let's say I'm going to make a baby hat. So if I'm going to make a baby hat, I need to know how big a baby's head is, right? So that's question one. How big is the baby head? Once I've made the style, made the decision about the style. Step one, how big is the baby head? Step two is decide how big the hat is. Step three is, well, there's my gauge so that I can figure out how many stitches to cast on. And step four would be those calculations. Now, on the question of sizes, right? And so I said, you know, we're making a baby hat. Let's dig into the question of sizes and sizing, okay? You've actually, when we're thinking about sizing, we've got two decisions to make. Decision number one is who is the thing for? Again, with a hat, children, babies, teens, men, women, wide range of sizes, just one. Who am I aiming it for? No wrong answer here, right? It's just your decision. Okay. The second question is, how do you want the thing to fit? And you need to answer both of these questions. They're very different and will have very different answers. Because you don't actually make a hat the same size as the head, right? Oh, what? That's interesting. So I'm glibly saying the hat's not the same size as the head. How did I learn that? How did I learn that a hat should fit with negative ease? Because that's really what this is about. The same is true of socks, by the way, both hats and socks. Like if we're thinking about a beanie style hat, a hat in formal language, we would say fits with negative ease. The hat or the sock should be smaller than the body part it's on. They should stretch to fit. How do I know that? How did I learn that? That goes back to me saying I've knitted a whole bunch of the thing that I'm making. Right? So yeah. So I need to kind of understand how an item fits so that I can decide. Make sense? Now, to kind of talk a bit about, and this is some inside baseball stuff, maybe give you some insight into the process. So this is where we get to talk all about grading. So grading, what's grading about? Grading is a scaling of a pattern to different sizes. Now, if you're just designing something for yourself, if you're replicating something that already exists, then what you're doing is you're measuring the thing that already exists. Those decisions are really easy, right? But if what you're wanting to do is calculate something or produce a pattern that fits multiple people, then we need to think about grading. Now, when I'm talking to designers, there's spoiler alert, grading is hard. I will not sugarcoat this. Grading is difficult. Okay. So someone says to me, well, I'm designing a pattern for a sock. Do I really need to calculate multiple sizes? Designing a pattern for a garment, well, yeah, I mean, that's going to seem fairly obvious that you probably need multiple sizes. But a hat, a sock, an accessory, do we need multiple sizes? I will say this. And this is a controversial statement. I'll put some context around this, but as a designer, it is better that you have a flattering, well-fitted, flattering is kind of a loaded word, but a piece that works on a smaller range of sizes than guess. Now, there is a very, very important movement in the industry towards having a broader range of sizes for patterns. I think it's so important, okay? Because having just small, medium, and large is ridiculous, because bodies come in many different shapes and sizes than simply a three standard small, medium, and large, okay? So we're seeing more and more patterns have a broader range of sizes, which I think is fantastic. However, it's only good if those sizes are actually properly and responsibly calculated. If, as a designer, you're guessing about what the small sizes and the large sizes need to look like, then you're going to get into trouble. I would rather have, and now let's think about the role of, as a designer, the role of social media and the role of promotion here. And if you're a user of Ravelry, you know, the first thing that you do when looking something up is go look at the picture of the finished objects. And if your garment has 10 sizes, but only 4 of them fit well, what you're going to have is 40% of your knitters are going to be happy, you know, thumbs up. Yay, you know, 4 out of 10 projects happy, yay, thumbs up, look, it fits me really well. And 6 out of 10 are going to be people who are unhappy. Yeah. So that's a 40% success rate. I would rather see a garment where 100% of the people are thumbs up. And then you're going to write specifically in the pattern notes, this garment has been graded for this particular size range. End of story. Okay. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be in the middle. You might do a garment specifically for petite bodies. You might do a garment specifically for plus size bodies. So I would, as a knitter, I would rather see something that I know has been responsibly sized than a guess. Because the other thing is, when I see a garment that purports to fit a range of bodies like this really well, there are garment patterns that I see that fit from babies to large adults. What that tells me is that that's going to be a very plain, untailored shape with a, and I mean this in a kind of just a non-judgmental way, an unsophisticated fit, right? Does that make sense? So it's there's an interesting tension around there. Is it important to be inclusive in our sizing? Heck yes, but not if you're guessing.
So that means that you cannot make a good pattern with all of those different sizes?
No, not necessarily. I mean, there's kind of, it's a good question, actually. It's an interesting question. There's kind of some limitations to this. I don't believe there is a well-tailored garment that works well on both babies and large adults, right? Makes sense? Because the proportions of a baby are very different than the proportions of adults. The body shapes and the fits that they need. So can you create a garment that's, let's think about a standard sweatshirt shape, right? Sweatshirt shapes kind of don't differ from baby size to adult sizes. T-shirts, right? I'm wearing a t-shirt dress. You could create this smaller or larger and it would work, but this is quite the opposite of a sophisticated fit. It's really hot today, right? This is quite the opposite of a sophisticated fit. So what I'm saying is that for a garment that needs to be more sophisticated, if you've got set-in sleeves and a tailored collar and a kind of a well-fitted neckline and all of that and waist shaping, that's going to be something that's going to be more specific to a particular set of body shapes and sizes. Does that make sense? Oh yeah. And so when I see something that's graded across a really wide range of sizes, generally, I'm going to assume that it's a less sophisticated fit. Fair? Make sense?
It does make sense, but are you also saying that grading the sizes using purely mathematical ratios or percentages is not the way to do it, or that is what would happen if you were doing these unsophisticated shapes?
So let me explain how we grade. So thank you. Yeah,
Welcome.
thank you. Because
Oh, and by the way, I was flabbergasted when I read the socks book and that you had started that with the, what was it, 500 responses from people telling you their measurements.
Yeah.
I thought, wow,
well, and in
this
fact,
woman loves empirical data.
yeah, in fact, that's actually answering your question about how we grade. So I'll come to it. So yes. So thank you for that. And I love that. I did it with hands too. Anyway, for my mitten book. So I will say this, if you're publishing, obviously having more sizes makes for a larger market. There are more people you can sell to, right? Okay. And I will also say this, and I feel really strongly about this. The expression one size fits all makes me twitch because it's just not true. It's okay to publish a hat pattern, for example, in one size. That's okay. But never, ever, ever, certainly not within earshot of me, use the phrase one size fits all, because it's not true. There is a wide range of differences. I've got 500 feet. There are adult feet. Some of them are 7 inches in circumference. Some adult feet are 11.5 inches in circumference. There is no way that one sock pattern will work equally well. Heads, same thing. There isn't one such size fits all with a head. For hats, for mittens, there's a big difference. Even a scarf. I am 5'2" on a tall day. I'm sitting upright. Okay. A very good friend of mine and a very old friend of mine clears 6 feet. Okay. And what makes for a fantastic, and by the way, we are both cisgendered women. This isn't a man-woman thing, right? What makes a great triple wrap scarf on me? Barely a double wrap on her, because she's that much taller than I am, right? So one size just doesn't fit all. Anyway, separate discussion. If you are publishing, just be clear in your patent information about who you're designing it for. So now, as to the question about how to grade, there are 2 questions. Okay. It is not, to cut to the chase, about ratios. It should never be about ratios. If somebody's doing it through ratios, they're not doing it right. Because what you need to do is you need to decide who you want it to fit and how you want it to fit, right? And I've already said this, these are different questions and we'll have different answers, okay? The answer to who is a grade set. Okay, what's a grade set? A grade set is a set of body measurements. Okay? The answer to how is design. Do I want the thing to fit tight? Do I want the thing to fit loose? Do I want the sleeves to be long? Do I want the sleeves to be short? Is it oversized? Is it really loose? Is it only slightly loose? Do I want, right? All of those decisions. Okay. What does a grade set look like? A grade set is a set of body measurements. It's a table. I'm trying to think if I've got one in this slide deck. I might need to change slide decks for this. The other thing about I've got so many slides here that with the images, it makes them very big. Sorry, apologies. Let me get my grading slides here. So the whole point about this with a grade set is what you've got is a set of body measurements. And those are the measurements that you need to calculate the sizing of something. I've got a couple of examples here. So this one is taken, I realize that the text may not be all that legible. This comes from a website, yarnstandards.com, run by the Craft Yarn Council of America. And what they do is for a bunch of different bodies, men, women, children, and a bunch of different garment types, different sort of, so they've got for garments, but also socks, hats, mittens. They've given you a collection of body measurements. Okay. And so here what they have is the chest circumference. The number 2 here is the center back next to wrist. So that's your wingspan. Number 3 is your back waist length. Number 4 is your cross back shoulder to shoulder measurement. Number 5 is your arm length, underarm to wrist. Number 6 is your upper arm circumference. Number 7 is your armhole depth. Number 8 is your waist circumference, right? These are body measurements, okay? This is one example of a grade set. There's another example of a grade set. So I'm sort of presenting this in the wrong order. So there is a designer called Isolde Teague. You may be familiar with their work. And Isolde, a number of years ago, published, and I'll give you the link to this. This is freely available, a set of body measurements. This is the one in inches. There's also a metric version available. And this is specifically for women's bodies. And these are body measurements, okay? And this is what we need to begin with. You cannot create a garment pattern based on ratios and proportions, because that doesn't take into account that body measurements don't conform to ratios and proportions. For example, the classic measurement that people talk about is shoulder width versus your body circumference, your torso circumference. So here, this particular measurement hardly changes, okay? There can be a huge difference in your body circumference. And so Isolde's chart specifically includes bodies that are between 30 and 60 inches around, okay? And so that's doubling your body circumference. And if we were to do this based on proportions, does that mean the shoulder width should be doubled? Heck no. Very specifically, let me get my annotations here. The shoulder width, where is it? Here, I was looking at it, the shoulder, she refers to it as shoulder length, okay? There's not even an inch between them. So for the smallest body size, you can expect your shoulder to be just a little less than 5 inches. For the largest body size, you can expect the shoulder to be not much more, a little bit less than 6 inches. So no, to cut to the chase, we don't do it with ratios. We don't do it with proportions. We don't do it with formulas. Does that make sense?
It does, Kate, but her arm length measurement is the same for all sizes.
It is. Yeah.
Why? I mean, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be obnoxious, but I know I always have to take things up in the sleeves because I have short arms.
Well, so your question is the other important piece, right? And that is that what these reflect is the data as collected by this person, right?
Okay.
They can't. There's absolutely no way that they can represent every single body, can they? They just can't, right? So they have to make some standard assumptions. Now, the fact the arm length is the same, and I'm just looking here, sorry, at the table, the arm length is the same for all bodies is actually kind of important here, because it's reflecting the fact that for most bodies, the length is pretty much the same. It doesn't kind of vary. So there's an assumption there. It doesn't vary. It may be that if you're less tall, right? Because this is going to be reflecting an average height. If, like me, you're less tall, your arm length may be shorter. But what these are is this is one particular data set that reflects one set of research that Isolde did. Fair? Yeah. And just as my sock measurement table is going to, I will have necessarily had to create some averages. So does that mean that you need to, is this going to 100% reflect your body? No, of course not. And my arms are shorter than this too, because I'm not very tall. Yeah.
So what you're also saying, I think, is that there is no standard, no definitive standard.
There is
You
no
probably find very similar grade sets, but there will probably be differences.
Well, and so, yeah, there is no such thing as a universal grade set.
Yeah.
Right. And then in designing, the garment will only fit the bodies included in the grade set.
Okay.
Now, some of the alterations are simpler than others. Altering sleeve length, yeah, altering body length, absolutely. But yeah, so what a designer needs to do to create a garment is identify the body measurements of the people that you want to fit, and then calculate the garment based on that. Does that make sense? And so this is where it's interesting. I think there's a lot of information, not fair. Let me rephrase that. I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about how this works. And I don't blame, any knitter for the misunderstanding. I think it's a lack of information. And I motivated the question you asked. That we're kind of assuming it's based on some ratios and some proportions, and in fact, at the risk of me being unkind again about seamless garment knitting, I think we also have been led to believe this might be the case because of the existence of some formulas. Okay, there are formulas to create seamless garments. There's the Elizabeth Zimmerman percentage system. You guys may be familiar with that, which is a tool that you can use to create a basic garment shape based on a couple of body measurements. And it does use percentages. It absolutely uses percentages. The Elizabeth Zimmerman percentage system says that if your torso circumference is a certain amount, the average body the neck will be about 40% of that. The arms, I think, off the top of my head, I think are about 25% of that, right? The waist is a certain, there are some sort of standard percentages, but those aren't a sophisticated fit by any stretch of the imagination. And they also don't work on a lot of bodies because they're not a sophisticated fit. The existence of those formulas, I think, has led us to believe that that's a lot of people to believe that that's the way the garments are graded and sized, and that's absolutely not. That's the exception rather than the rule. And what you get from that is garments that don't really fit. What designers are doing is, or what designers should be doing again, is choosing the bodies you want to fit. So when I go back to my hat, I want this to fit a baby, a newborn. So then I have to get the relevant measurements. How big is a newborn head? I need to know that. Okay. Now, resources are available. You don't have to rush around with a tape measure and try and find a baby. Resources exist for this. So, and I've got some pointers for you, but choose who you want to fit, get the relevant measurements, and then decide how will your garment fit. So in the case of a hat, we know that a hat should stretch to fit, right? Although with a baby hat, it shouldn't be too tight. And again, how do I know that? I've knitted a few hats, a footwork, and then you calculate the garment measurements. And the garment measurements, it's not about ratios and proportions. It's your body measurement plus your ease. Does that make sense? Does that help a bit? So in terms of sort of how I go about doing this in the process, you know, choosing the bodies I want to fit, that's a choice. That's my design choice. The relevant measurements are research. Determining how my garment fits, that's a design decision. And then calculating those garment measurements, that's arithmetic. Make sense? And so, yeah, she says glibly, you just do the math, right? So back to the discussion about grade sets here. There's some resources, and I want to make sure that we've got, oh yeah, here we go. Okay, these are correct. So this will be, because I'm jumping between two sets of slides, apologies, I just wanted to confirm. This will be in the handout that I sent to you guys. So if you're looking for sizing, again, these are body measurements. So feet, heads, and hands, these are resources. Feet and hands, I've published those in my sock and mitten book, but I've also made those publicly available. Head measurements, Woolly Wormhead has the best set of head measurements. I actually, with her permission, drafted off hers when I published my hat book. So that's for accessories. For garments, there's a couple of resources available. The Craft Yarn Council, as I referenced, they've got body measurements, and they've got both for men and women. There's actually a massive hole in the industry. We don't have a lot of good body measurement information for men. It's mostly for women. Okay. For women's size only, Kim McBride Evans has done some good work in this area. Isolda, as I mentioned, they've done some good work in this area. And then there's also a designer called Jill Walcott Knits who's done some work in this area. And these people are making these grade sets publicly available that you can use there. Does that make sense? Does that help a bit? So going back to the question that was asked, yeah, we shouldn't be. And I would hope the garments aren't being created based on proportions. It really is, you know, it's a more complex task, but then you get a better fit out of it. Make sense? Which is why, as I say, then, you know, I'm making this radical statement that I'd rather see a pattern in a smaller number of sizes that actually fits properly, where you've done the math so it fits properly. And I am, if I get nervous about these patterns that come in these massively broad ranges of sizes, because I worry that they have been calculated just through ratios and maybe not going to fit. Fair? I will say this, though, I need to put a little bit of an asterisk around this. There is one company, Tin Can Knits. They do broad ranges of sizes, and generally, now they're doing pretty simple shapes. Generally, those guys know what they're doing, so I'm not talking about them. But there are others where I see people just, yeah. And as a knitter, I mean, here's your rule: never be the first person to knit a project, right? Never be the first 20 people to knit a project. Yeah, because you want to make sure it works. So in terms of other aspects to the process too, so, you know, if we grade the sizing, we also, and this is one nobody ever talks about, we have to grade the yarn requirements as well. We're not guessing. There are two ways people do this. I actually, to figure out how much yarn the other sizes require, I actually calculate the number of stitches in the thing for every single size. So I know how many stitches I knitted. It's actually, the numbers are horrifying. Like, it's actually a jaw-dropping number when I 27,000 stitches. But for each size, I figure out how many stitches there are, and then I know how much yarn I used for the sample size, and then I'm able to calculate the yarn for the other sizes as well. By the way, as a designer, if you're publishing, this should always be multiplied. It should never be your actual number, but I always multiply the yardage requirement by about 1.15 to allow for swatching and just general overage and people making adjustments. Some people actually do this also by surface area. I know some designers who kind of calculate square inches, similar thing. But yeah, we have to do that. Yeah. Interesting. Interesting question. As a designer, I spend an awful lot of time with Microsoft Excel. Yeah, or, you know, use your favorite spreadsheet program. But yeah, it's an awful lot of time. So yeah. And, you know, this is interesting too. This points to some of the resources that we see out there. I've seen resources that are offered to teach grading and to teach garment sizing. And a lot of the time, those resources, they seem to teach you how to use a spreadsheet program to do the calculations, but they're missing that first piece of the puzzle, which is making that design decision about how wide should the shoulder be? Where do I want the armhole edging to sit? How deep do I want the armhole edging? How wide should the neck be, right? And I see those decisions as actually being the much more complicated decisions than, oh, well, if the neck is this wide, then that's the number of stitches I need to bind off. That's arithmetic. Does that help? Does that make a bit of sense? Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, this is also where I can, you know, we have to kind of wade into the discussion about the role of test knitters too. Because we're seeing there's been an interesting change in the industry in the last less than 10 years about how we check patterns. And it's connected to this absolutely vitally important movement towards inclusivity in broader size ranges. Okay. We're seeing designers using test knitters now as a way of supporting the movement towards inclusivity. But test knitting is an interesting thing. And if I may express an opinion, as a designer, it's getting a little bit problematic. It's getting a little bit problematic because I'm seeing a couple of things happen. I'm seeing that knitters are frankly being taken advantage of, test knitters, because designers are getting knitters to do a lot of work for them. I'm also seeing the value of technical editing, like technical editing kind of falling by the wayside because there seems to be an expectation that test knitting can achieve everything. And it's just not true. Test knitting has a place, but where we're running into difficulties is that knitters are expecting that a garment's been test knit in every size. And it's absolutely not possible unless you have a massive audience, right? There's a whole issue around this kind of thing. So we're seeing, and I've seen some really fascinating discussions about this. People saying, I won't buy a pattern if it's not been test knit in every size. And as a designer, I can't do that. I don't have an audience to do that. If I publish a sock pattern in 5 sizes, I need to find 5 different people who are willing to knit a sock for me for free, because I'm not making enough money selling patterns to compensate them. Knit a sock pattern for me for free to a deadline with specific requirements. And if you're test knitting something, then you can't make those modifications to make the sleeve lengths. There are sleeves. Okay, socks don't have sleeves, but you get where I'm going, right? And then give sensible feedback on that. And because it's work, right? So to put that requirement on a designer means the designer is going to have to put that requirement on knitters. And if you've got an audience that's big enough and good enough to be able to do that for you, then that's fantastic. But I don't know. I mean, call me old fashioned, but I don't think I should be using volunteer labor to do an essential aspect of my business. Because the other thing people are using test knitters for is they're using them to generate samples for promotion and for marketing perspectives. Now, is it bad to use testers? No, it's not bad to use testers. That's not what I'm talking about. But we're in a terrible position where a knitter will say, I'm not going to buy it if it hasn't been tested. And if I can't afford to compensate my testers, or I don't have the audience of people who are willing to do it for free, then I can't publish a pattern. So there's some tension there. It comes back to a lot of it. There's kind of two reasons. And one is that it's really important to communicate that we have successfully, I said it, right? That we have successfully graded a pattern so that it responsibly fits bodies outside that standard range. So fits those plus size bodies, fits those petite bodies, right? We need to demonstrate that. And the best way to demonstrate that, of course, is have samples photographed in those other sizes. Absolutely. So we want to see those finished projects in that wide range of sizes. And that's one thing. And we call it sample knitting, right? And that should, frankly, if you ask me, because it's a marketing task, be a paid thing, be compensated somehow, right? And also when you're asking somebody to knit a sample, you should be compensating them because you're going to dictate that they knit it exactly to the pattern as written, exactly in this yarn, exactly this, exactly that, right? Like it's not a you get to customize it thing. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is, though, we see testing as kind of a way of, there's an expectation that it's the only way to prove that something fits, right? As a way of checking. So they're showing off that it works, but also just checking that it works. And that's where technical editing comes in, because knitting something is a massively inefficient way of checking that it fits. Because you'll have noticed it takes a while to knit something. A technical editor can check that. And more importantly, a technical editor can check that consistency across multiple sizes. Because if you've got 10 sizes and 10 different knitters, each knitter may say, yeah, the sleeve fits me and the sleeve fits that, and yeah. But then you'll have someone say, well, the sleeve is too long for this size that I made, who said that they're always having to shorten the sleeves. Yeah, I mean, me too. So if I'm a test knitter, the feedback I'm going to give is the sleeve is too long. Does that mean the pattern's bad? No. Right? It means that the standard grade set is for, you know, someone who's got longer arms, and I happen to be not within that grade set, and I'm shorter than the pattern was written for. Doesn't mean it's a bad pattern. So testing is thorny, and the reliance on testing where it's an imperfect solution. Do we need absolutely to demonstrate that our patterns work on the broad range of sizes we've published? As I said that we need to make sure that if you're publishing 10 sizes, they all actually work on those bodies. But testing, first of all, there's a whole problem around doing it, people doing it for free. Secondly, you're not getting enough of a test, an actual test and an assessment from individual knitters. You're not getting the full consistency check. You're also, frankly, not getting someone who's checking all of those instructions either. And a technical editor does this. And I'm seeing a remarkable number of people who, in the same way that this, again, it's not the knitter's fault. It's not the audience's fault. We do a lousy job of explaining what we're doing. In the same way that it's not really well understood how we grade a garment, it's not really well understood what a technical editor does, right? So the technical editor is the one who can check that, and I can, based on my understanding of garment sizes, I can look at that and I can say, you know what, your shoulder widths are right, but your armhole depths are off for an average set of armhole, for an average set of bodies. So yeah, so it's an interesting thing. Have you guys done any test knitting? Have you got involved in this? Yeah. Has it been work you've been compensated for in any way?
I did a test knit for Gudrun Johnston.
Yeah.
Because I've knit over a dozen of her patterns. I
Yeah.
know she's good. It was difficult. It was a very difficult pattern, but I'm advanced.
Yeah.
I was happy to do it. And we received a copy of the book.
Good.
Good. Her Shetland, the pattern book. She redid her mother's patterns.
Good.
And we were actually mentioned in the book. We were all
Excellent.
listed in the book.
Good. That's important.
Yeah.
So-
and for me, that was enough. And
Yeah.
there was
yeah.
yarn support. We got a discount from either Brooklyn Tweed or Jameson and Smith. So I felt fine. I have also
good.
tested patterns where I don't think the designer tested the pattern because I found an error in the chart from the jump. And I thought, I feel like the designer should at least, it was a hat. I felt like they should have knit the hat with their chart. And
Well, and again, that's important to distinguish there too. That's what a technical editor can do too, right? So testing isn't, so that's my other piece. Testing absolutely has a role, and I love that you got acknowledgement and you got compensation. That's the bit that's really important to me. The bit that I struggle with is that when you've got people doing it and there's just nothing in because there's a lot of labor, right? It's an awful lot of labor, and you're making really big demands of the people. But as a design, for a hat, the hat doesn't need to be tested. What you can absolutely do there is you are a technical editor is able to check that without needing to. And in fact, you need that. Any designer, what you said was interesting, that you felt the designer had needed to check their chart. I can't check my own work. Nobody can check my own work, right? So it's, you need a fresh set of eyes. You need a second set of eyes. And that's what that technical editor does. They're the ones who you realize you forgot a decrease on row 2, right? It's like, right. It's because I mistranscribed it. It was right in my notebook. I made a mistake when I recreated it. Or there was the famous, and again, it was a hat, because hat pattern I very nearly published. I was that close to publishing, and I realized that I'd obviously been over caffeinated that day. And I apparently, in the small size, you needed to cast on 900 stitches. I just hit the keyboard a little bit too heavy, but you don't check your own work. So do patterns need to be checked? 100%. But we can't be, as an industry, kind of both as designers and end users, demanding that other people provide uncompensated labor to make that happen. There's a way to do that, and that is through technical editors are required. So where I'm pushing back here, the problem I have is not with test knitting. The challenge that I have is that knitters are being educated that it's no good if it's not been tested. And so that's why, Peg, I pushed a little bit back on your language. Your language isn't wrong. The pattern needs to be tested, but test knitting isn't the only way to test it. Does that make sense?
Great. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, it's an interesting conundrum, right? It's an interesting problem. So also, do we need to prove that it works in those sizes? Heck yeah. Do we need to have samples knitted? Yes. But again, that's not something necessarily where free labor, uncompensated, unacknowledged labor should be doing. Fair? Okay, I'll get down off my soapbox now. But it's connected to all of this stuff, right? It's connected to this discussion about responsible sizing and making sure that what we're doing is publishing patterns that are good. And I would say, to name, Gudrun's work is wonderful. And I would say that in some ways, Gudrun doesn't need to test her patterns, and Gudrun works with professional technical editors. So the tension there is interesting too, because Gudrun doesn't really need, like, her, I bet you her it was perfect, right? There weren't any, it probably was great, right? Or pretty darn close. Yeah. So in that case, the reason she's test knitting is so that she can say that it's been tested. And there could be, and I don't know whether this is the case, I would jump, you know, there may or may not have been an aspect of just having finished projects and having word of mouth marketing too, so that you're able to talk about having knitted it. And so that, we call it preview knitting, and that's amazing. And I love it when somebody's willing to knit something and review it, right? As a designer, knit something and talk about, because what you just did was an amazing piece of marketing for Gudrun's work. Because you're a happy user, you know, with a happy end result, and it's a wonderful thing. And so as designers, we really value that. It's where the expectation gets set up that you have to. Okay, again, I did say I got my soapbox, so yeah. But it's an, you know, interesting thing. Changing the subject. Talking about writing instructions and reworking instructions. So there's this book that's been written about writing instructions by me. I wrote this book. Yeah. So part of me and my background is I come at this from a technical writing background. So yes, I studied mathematics at university, and then I went and worked in software for a number of years. And a lot of what I did was technical writing. And this is why I say at the very beginning that being creative and being really good at designing and being able to write the instructions are two really different skill sets. And some of the best, most creative designers I know cannot write instructions to save their lives. Does that mean that they're bad at designers? Heck no. It's a left brain, right brain thing. And some people are good at this and some people are not. And that's okay, right? It's a communication task. So I wrote this book, and the whole point of that book, and again, for clarity, this is sort of what motivated me at the beginning when I talked about designing and pattern writing being two separate tasks. I wrote, you know, guide to writing knitting patterns. And sometimes people buy the book and say, well, I thought it was going to teach me how to do those calculations. So that the book that I wrote is quite literally just about writing those instructions. If you are interested in learning about doing those calculations, then that's where I point you to books. Some of them I've written, some of them other people have written, but where we do the calculations is one aspect. But writing up those instructions may or may not be required. If you're looking to recreate something that already exists, then, you know, not something you're necessarily going to be concerned about. But writing instructions that other people can knit from. So to the point about the beginner knitting classes, then that is a book that can exist, that can possibly help you with that. But writing instructions is surprisingly hard because there are so many assumptions that go into things. So when I was my first year of university, I understand they do this much earlier now in school, and I'm glad they did. They assigned as a challenge, the assignment was write instructions for making a peanut butter sandwich. Have any of you guys done this or taught this?
Yes, I do. Had included that in the GED classes I taught
Yeah.
as a way to judge not only writing skills, but also critical thinking skills.
Yeah. And it's hard, right?
Absolutely.
This is incredibly hard. So when I did it as well, so making a peanut butter sandwich, the way the assignment as I was given was write instructions for brushing your teeth. Okay, and everybody would start with put toothpaste on your toothbrush. Well, how? Well, okay, you have to take the lid off the tooth, right? Yeah, make a peanut. Well, you put the peanut butter, you get your bread. Well, where's the bread? right? And put the bread on the peanut butter, or put the peanut butter on the bread. Well, you have to take the lid off the jar, get the jar of peanut butter out of the fridge, take the lid off the jar, right? Like use a knife to spread the peanut, and then the instructions differ based on what knowledge people have, right? Is someone going to know what a jar of peanut butter is? Maybe they don't read English. Maybe you're writing instructions for kids who don't yet read. How do they identify what a jar of peanut butter is? So yeah, so writing instructions, I personally find this a fascinating problem, and I don't say this to intimidate, but just to know that it is a really different skill than designing. And so yeah, my book is all about helps you write that out. And I've listed in that book, I've given you a template for kind of all of the things I look for and what makes a good knitting pattern, right? How to identify what a good pattern actually is, what aspects are required. And I've got here, sorry, I'm going to jump around between, if that's of interest, I've got some, a slide on that too. Yeah, Pam.
So just today we had, I hear this very often. Somebody came in, kind of stuck in their knitting pattern and
Yeah.
really just, they thought they knew what to do.
Yeah.
And what the directions said were what she thought she should do, but it wasn't a combination of words that she was familiar with. And how she interpreted it didn't register with her. And her final comment was, why can't they just say it in plain English? And I'm like, because there isn't plain English,
Exactly. Yeah.
there isn't plain English.
Right.
Those are the words that made sense in the designer's head. This is how they were brought up. This is the whatever it is. And we hear that often. And I see that often.
Yeah.
Boom, boom, boom. They're all saying the same thing with a whole different set of words.
Yeah, I know. It's like recipes,
Yes.
oh, that I wish that there were a standard language. There isn't.
Yes,
There isn't.
right.
So, one of the things I say to people is if you find a designer or a publication that uses a style that makes sense for you, stick with them, right? Stick with them.
Right.
Keep using theirs. Yeah, it's not always necessarily so simple. And the other thing is that you can write instructions for something that's incredibly easy to knit, but the instructions make it hard. I'm sure you've seen those. Equally, I've seen instructions for the most complex things, but they're written out in such a way that they make it really easy. Yeah. Yeah. I had a case recently where I was away from home and I was, running out of craft project, and there was a beginner embroidery kit in the dollar store. And I bought it, and goodness, the instructions were terrible. It's not hard to embroider. It uses stem stitch and a straight stitch, and there's a couple of French knots. I don't know if you guys have, but it's not complicated, and it wasn't a big project. But holy cow, if I didn't have any knowledge of embroidery, there is no way I would have been able to finish it. Right. So the simplest thing can be made difficult via bad instructions. Equally, the most complicated thing can be made easy with good instructions. So so one of the things I always tell people to do is, not all of sets of instructions are made equal. So I'm always telling them to kind of read through before I make an assessment. Because the other thing about, I said at the beginning, there's nothing unique out there. So I don't know, Beth and Pam, you have this experience in the store, but I know I've had this experience with people where we get a little bit stuck sometimes where, nope, this is the one I want to make. I've got these instructions. This is the one I want to make. But if it is a plain, whether it's a simple embroidery of a daisy, or whether it's just a plain chocolate chip cookie or just a plain hat or a plain sock or what have you, it may be that those instructions are not written out for your level. And so it's okay to say, I'm going to try a different one. And we do get stuck sometimes. So I'm always telling people before they choose a pattern, just kind of read through. And even if it's not all entirely available to them, I would say about craft patterns, whether knitting or crochet, You know, assess and make sure it's going to work for you. And even if you can't see the whole thing, because we can't necessarily if we're buying it online, I would use the same rule with choosing a craft pattern the way that you might choose a restaurant. Slightly distasteful metaphor, but I hope you get where I'm going with this one. If you find a new coffee shop or a new restaurant and you step in and the place is filthy, you know, there's half empty coffee cups all over the host station, and there's dirty menus everywhere, and there's a mop on the floor, and there's dust bunnies, and there's a wet cleaning cloth on the bar, and you're going to look at that and think, no thank you. Whereas if you're going to go out to a restaurant and everything is pristine and tidy and looks great, you're going to draw some conclusions about the state of the kitchen, are you not? If the information in the pattern, even before you've read all the instructions, is good, there's a good introduction, it's giving clear information about what materials are required, it's giving clear information about the sizes that are on offer, it's giving you the designer's name, it's giving you a designer website, that kind of thing, you can feel a bit more confident about the rest of the instructions. Make sense? And, you know, I talk about what's a good pattern, but really all of that stuff is minimum. If a pattern doesn't have the text, the stuff in the sections in black, I'm not even going to bother, because that's not setting you up for, it's not providing the core, the base information. But what I really want, particularly if this is something that I'm new to knitting, I want to see a lot more information. And in the materials list, for example, yarn substitution suggestions, that doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to substitute the yarn, but that tells me that the designer has thought about who's using it, and they're going to be more expansive in their instructions, right? And in the size information, I don't just want small, medium, or large, but I want to know who it fits. I want to see schematics. I want to see finished measurements. I don't just want instructions. I want a glossary and references and techniques. I don't just want one photo, I've got multiple photographs. I don't just want a name of the pattern. I want tell me about it. Give me a sense of the level of difficulty. Level of difficulty is kind of fungible. It's a bit weird, but I want something that's maybe going to tell me what skills are used, or what techniques I need to know before I launch into the project. So, you know, spend a little bit of time making sure that the pattern is written in a way that makes sense for you. As someone who's knitted a fair few pairs of socks in my life, do I need a fully detailed sock pattern like that? No, I can get away with, you know, a minimal sock pattern. But if this is your first sock, you're going to want a good, expansive set of instructions. So choosing a project, choosing a pattern is not just about, is this a thing I want to make, but are these instructions? And that leap can be hard to make sometimes, because it feels like we're pushing something away that we wanted to make, but are these instructions written in such a way that I'm going to be successful? Yeah. All right. I've been jumping all over the place here. I'm going to go back to my list of the questions that we've asked. So in understanding the process, hopefully I've given you a few insights. Talked a little bit about strategies for recreating an existing garment. So again, with that one, honestly, if there's a pattern for something that kind of gives you the core of what you want, there's your template, right? Use it. Shamelessly and proudly use it. Yeah. If you do want to create specifically a garment from scratch, which you may well want to do, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just, what are you looking to do, and what do you enjoy doing? Really, you want just to knit a project and have it work out. That's one thing. If you want to learn about how garments are structured and how to do the calculations, that's an amazing thing too. That I cannot recommend highly enough a book called The Ultimate Sweater Book, written by Amy Herzog. Absolutely the best thing out there to learn about garment construction. She's still very much focused, and it's less about creating garments for publication, but it's about creating a garment that works for you. Fantastic book. Excellent, excellent. And socks, mittens, I'm going to recommend my books because heck yeah. And hat, there's a book by, again, Woolly Wormhead's work is excellent on hats. And then there's also, if you want something plainer, my top down hat book works as well. But yeah, but this is what this is all about, right? That, you know, for me, my work is about giving people standard templates that they can use as a jumping off point for customization. That's kind of what I do. And, you know, I landed there myself because I found that was what I needed to do as a knitter, because again, not very tall, small hands and feet, right? I was always needing to make something and tweak it. And you know, I think that we sometimes forget that, but it's important. And to the conversation about sleeve length, there's a lot of stuff that's going to have to be customized. I mean, I have never in my life been able to buy a pair of jeans that were the right length, ever. You know? I like it when rolled up cuffs are fashionable because then I don't have to worry, right? I'm not spending money at the dry cleaner and having them shortened. So yeah, you know, I've never been able to buy something where the sleeves are exactly the right length, but I know that, and that's okay. And so, you know, we need to remember that when we're buying knitting patterns too, but the magic there is in choosing one where the alterations are simpler for you to do, right? Okay, all right. On reworking instructions and what makes a good pattern. So yeah, what makes a good pattern, a little bit, giving you a little bit of a sense there, and on reworking those instructions, possibly that book might help, Doris. But yeah, I can probably also point you to some other things. But you know, it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting discussion, and you know, if you want to kind of, there's no reason why you can't kind of create your own style suitable for those knitters. I mean, yes, it's bad news that not every pattern is written to the same language, but it also maybe gives you a good opportunity to be okay to kind of build a style that works particularly for your users. Yeah. Okay, so a couple minutes left. Are there other questions? I'm hoping this has been kind of interesting, giving you some insights and some food for thought.
I'm wondering, there was Kent State University has I believe it's a textile museum, but they certainly have a textile program.
Yeah.
And they had an exhibit that I did not get to see, but I hope some of our customers got to see it, that had machine knitted shoes. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen like the Nike shoes and the other brands that are like integrally knitted. And you said earlier in this lecture that seamless garments are completely possible to be made in machine, and they're not. And it just made me wonder if there was a way, like we hear about AI and we hear about virtual this and virtual that, but I wonder if there's a program that would allow you to virtually knit a pattern that would allow you to see it sort of in 3 dimensions and give you a sense of what it would look like as a finished garment.
What an interesting question. Huh.
I've been to the Kent State Fashion Museum, and I took a tour there, and they gave us a tour of their knitting lab.
Yeah.
And their computerized machines. And one of their instructors is all about short rows. So she has made garments with godettes and panels that are completely seamless and it's all short rows.
Yeah.
And it's computer aided design.
Yeah.
So it'll
absolutely
feed straight. Yeah. It's fascinating. I mean, it's absolutely worth a visit down there.
Yeah.
But I think it's the one instructor is just, that's her thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a store. I don't know if you guys live near one. There's a store called Uniqlo. They're a Japanese store. They do have stores in North America, and I'm actually just looking at their website now. They've got all their fall stuff already. Holy cow, I'm not ready for sweaters yet. 3D knit. They have a whole section 3D knit, and these guys are experimenting. Features of 3D knit. Let's see what it said. Oh, I'm going to share this very quickly. So yeah, the future of knitwear, 3-dimensional seamless designs. So yeah, they are doing this. So, you know, I was being a little bit glib when I said nobody's doing it, but yeah, so doing this 3D knit thing. So it is actually all completely possible by machine. So yeah, some interesting stuff to look out there. The point that I was making specifically was that there are a lot of the time we don't see it done by machine because you get things that are too heavy and they sag. But yeah. So there's, you know, there are technical possibilities, but then one also has to weigh the result you get and how it works. Oh, yeah. It sounds like a fascinating museum exhibition. I should figure out how to go see it. Excellent.
We could see if we could work something out.
Yeah.
But my tour there was years ago. It was with a textile group. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure they'd be willing to set something up.
Yeah.
For, you know.
I need to look at this. Yeah. Textile Kent State. There it is. Very cool.
It's a nice resource to have locally.
I can imagine. Yeah. Holy cow. Okay. All right. Yeah. I'm going to get distracted. I'm going to come up with plans for my next career move. Yes. Okay. All right. I'm hoping this has been an interesting discussion. There's been some good questions. Thank you. Giving you, a little bit of a peek behind the curtain. I showed you the slide with my contact information. Please don't be shy about getting in touch. This is such a broad topic, and there's so many great resources and things depending on kind of what your area of interest is. So you know, you can drop me a note and I'd be happy to continue the conversation, point you in the direction of something depending on how you kind of where you want to jump off from this. But yeah, I hope if nothing else has given you a sense of kind of how this all works and some food for thought around some stuff. And yeah. Thank you for letting me express some opinions and share some of my share some of my work with you guys.
You're absolutely passionate about the work that you do, and I have read several of your books and have several of your books, so I know that there is an amazing amount of not just detail, but as they were as was said earlier, like 500 foot measurements that I discuss when we talk about, you know, measuring your feet in sock class. I talk about, you know, everybody's foot isn't the same, and your feet are unique. And it is really a pleasure to get to have this one-on-one time with you. This small group setting has been such a pleasure to enjoy. And for the people who are watching this, there will be a link to a video. I think Pam and I might have to edit it because it'll be the Zoom link, and that starts a little bit earlier than the actual program is. Anyway, we will be seeing Kate again in person next, and then we will be hopefully seeing Kate again next fall with more classes available online. And Kate has a broad curriculum of things that she can talk to us about. So thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you for the opportunity. I will absolutely send it. Might not be tonight. It might be first thing in the morning, but I'll send a PDF with the slides that I showed with the links and the resources and things so that when you send the recording out, that will be there. But again, thank you. This has been an utter delight to get to know you guys and visit virtually. And I'm very much looking forward to visiting in person later this month. It's we were saying, Pam and I were saying that it felt like it's been a long way away, and all of a sudden, not that far anymore. So it's nice. I'm very excited about my visits and looking forward to spending more time with you guys. And thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. We really appreciate having such wonderful customers.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks.
Good
Good
night.
night, everybody.
Good night.
Right.
All right.
Good night.
Bye. Thanks, Kim. Bye.
Bye-bye.